Well, welcome, friends. My name is Enton Eller, and I'm serving as the webinar tech for today's webinar. And I'm glad to welcome all of you who have come, and we hope that we get a couple more of you yet to join us. Before we begin, if you look up in the left part of your screen, you've all seen the chat, and I'm glad that you've started to interact. That's where you'll post your questions and comments. And if you have technical issues or something's not working right with your broadcast, feel free to write me a note, and I'll do my best to see if I can get you back online or at least take care of what the problems might be. A warning on that, we've been told that Andrew may have a blackout coming through his area, and if he does, he will not be able to continue to broadcast, and so we'll just pick up and go, but we'll pray that that's not going to happen until at least after things are over. For those of you that have been following our series, as you see above my head, there's a few more recordings that are available, and we'll be continuing into the new year. We just don't have all those times scheduled yet, so please check back as part of this continuing series on Anabaptism. And we're really looking forward to more of the conversation that we've been really enjoying so far. For those of you that have missed our previous presentations, recordings are available, and you can just follow the links to find those. For those of you from the Church of the Brethren that wish continuing education units, I'll be sharing the instructions on how to get those at the end of our webinar. Unfortunately, those are still for only live participation and not for those watching the recording later, but I'll be glad to help those of you that qualify to be able to get those. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Stan Duick, the host of this whole series, and Stan, introduce our presenter for today.
Thank you, Anton, and welcome to everyone who is able to join us today. We see several people from various parts of the globe, South Africa, South Wales, as well as here in the United States. And so we just appreciate you joining us and hope you enjoy the webinar. Today is part 3 of a 7-part series on the heart of Anabaptism. We've been covering 7 of the core convictions that are listed on the Anabaptist Network UK website. And these are convictions that summarize the heart of Anabaptism and its contemporary significance. Today we're going to reflect on Beyond a Christendom Imagination, which takes a look at core conviction number 3, which is Western culture is slowly emerging from a Christendom era when church and state jointly presided over a society in which almost all were assumed to be Christian. Whatever positive contributions on values and institutions were made, Christendom seriously, though, distorted the gospel, marginalized Jesus, and left churches ill-equipped for mission in a post-Christendom culture. As we reflect on this today with Andrew, we are committed to learning from the experience and perspectives of movements such as Anabaptism that rejected standard Christendom assumptions and pursued alternative ways of thinking and behaving. Andrew is going to guide us through this time of thought and reflection, and it's a real pleasure to introduce to you Andrew Suderman. He's Canadian, and has had the opportunity to live in numerous areas of the world, including Costa Rica, Bolivia, Colombia, before moving to South Africa. Andrew holds degrees in theology and philosophy. He has also spent years working with offenders and ex-offenders, as well as supervising a homeless shelter for people. But since 2009, Andrew has been serving as the director of the Anabaptist Network, South Africa, while also working on his PhD in theology. And so it is a real privilege and pleasure to invite Andrew to share with us this afternoon. And so, Andrew, please join us, and we look forward to what you have to share.
Well, good evening or good afternoon, depending where in the world you are. Thank you, Stan, for those words, and Enton for introducing me and introducing this webinar. I'm still baffled, and I'm baffled by the opportunity and the ability to be able to do this. This is still mind-blowing stuff. I want to say thank you, first of all, to the Anabaptist Network in the UK for the invitation to share some thoughts with regards to this webinar series that they've been organizing. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share some perspectives. And thank you for the Church of the Brethren and for specifically Enton and Stan for hosting and facilitating these webinars. These guys are incredible at what they do, and they're incredible at walking you through what these things can do. So thank you very much for your help. As Stan said, my name is Andrew Suderman. My wife and I are Mennonite Church Canada witness workers living in South Africa. We've been living in South Africa since 2009, and we help to coordinate the Anabaptist Network in South Africa. So that keeps us busy and keeps us out of trouble for the most part, or at least out of the trouble that we want to stay away from. Today I've been asked to share some thoughts on the following core conviction that the Anabaptist Network in the UK has put together, or has one of their convictions. Stan already read it, but I think it might be good just to go through it again, just to see what it is that we're going to talk about and look and explore today. As Western culture is slowly emerging from the Christendom era, when the church and state jointly presided over a society in which almost all were assumed to be Christian, whatever its positive contributions on values and institutions, Christendom seriously distorted the gospel, marginalized Jesus, and has left the churches ill-equipped for mission in a post-Christendom culture. As we reflect on this, we are committed to learning from the experience and perspectives of movements such as Anabaptism that rejected standard Christendom assumptions and pursued alternative ways of thinking and behaving. My intention today is to share some thoughts and some reflections about this conviction. And given the fact that we live in South Africa, my reflections will obviously and inevitably arise from our experience here. And so my intention this evening or afternoon, wherever you are, is to briefly touch on the notion of Christendom, looking at some of the implications and consequences that arose for the church specifically in the shift toward what I describe as a Christendom imagination. And then I'll touch on and look at the effect of such an imagination in the South African context and what Anabaptism has looked like, or what the way it has emerged or is emerging in the South African context. So that's my hope for today. But before I go too much further, I think a couple of comments regarding the notion, or regarding the word imagination. The last couple of years, I've begun to use this notion, this word imagination, a lot more, and I do so because, for me, it seems that it's precisely the imagination that allows us to think and to dream. It's what allows us to be creative in thinking what's possible. Our imagination may provide the opportunity to agitate us to move in pursuit of that possibility as well. Thus the phrase, the power of ideas. Imagination is a powerful thing, but it's also a dangerous thing, especially for those who dare to imagine and dream of a different reality, a different possibility, and strive to make it a reality. This is why people such as Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, Steve Biko, and the Anabaptist movement were considered as revolutionary. They not only challenged the given social order or the status quo, but they dared people to think differently, to imagine a different reality in the way we could relate to one another. And so it's no surprise, therefore, that Martin Luther King Jr., Steve Biko, and many of the early Anabaptists were killed and martyred. Tutu narrowly escaped. So this is why I tend to focus on the notion of imagination. And my interest today is to move away from a Christendom-based imagination and explores what other possibilities there might be. For example, what would a Christocentric or a Jesus-centered imagination and way of life shape the way in which we relate to one another in society? This, it seems to me, gets at the heart of Anabaptism and the conviction that we want to explore today. Last December, my wife and our kids and I, we had the opportunity and the privilege to visit Rome as we made our way back to Canada for a visit. One of the most striking places that we visited while we were in Rome were the catacombs. These catacombs were tunnels that were dug in the outskirts of Rome where the early Christians could bury their dead, many of whom died as a result of persecution. These were the spaces outside of the city walls where Christians could bury their dead, as Roman law forbade Christian burial places within the city limits. It was amazing to see and walk through these catacombs. Here are just a few pictures of taken from within these tunnels. This is a statue of the Good Shepherd that is just outside of one of the catacombs. What fascinated me the most in visiting these catacombs was to see and to compare the social location as to where Christians could bury their dead before and after the 4th century. It was interesting to see such a tangible example of the shift that began in the 4th century, that which has been described as the Constantinian shift. Indeed, looking at the way in which the church buried their dead, we see a very tangible shift not only in location but also in practice, from burying in humbleness, modesty, and meekness, which included the way in which leaders of the early church were buried, that took place outside of the city walls, to the more extravagant and opulent way in which the dead were buried inside of the city walls, especially the leaders. It was an incredibly tangible example that marked the shift in relationship between the church and the empire. And this shift had a significant influence regarding the Christian imagination that emerged from it. Now, surely being included in the city, even gaining social prominence, was not all that negative. Surely being accepted was and is a positive thing. And yeah, it is. Being accepted is a good thing. Moving away from persecution or from persecuting others, whoever they are, is a positive step. The problem, I think, arose from the compromises made, especially in how the Christian gospel was understood and embodied in becoming accepted into the city, not unlike the compromises we might make today in wanting to be accepted in whatever culture or social location that we find ourselves in. Harry Huebner, a retired professor at Canadian Mennonite University, helpfully highlights the implications of this shift and the new relationship that began to emerge between the church and the empire in the 4th century. He highlights several traits that emerged as a result of the empire's conversion. The first distinction, or the first trait that he notes, is a distinction that emerged between the visible and invisible church. Whereas the church was a socially and publicly constituted visible counterbody, after Constantine, the true church, true in the sense that it was a community of the faithful and committed, no longer assumed to be visible. The true church was now found internally in the hearts of men and women for God alone to see. Second, a separation emerged between the social and the spiritual. Whereas for early Christians, the church was itself a political body in that it addressed issues of economics, governance, power, enemies, and new social relationships. The new relationship between the church and the empire introduced a division of labor. The church dealt with the spiritual and individual, whereas the empire dealt with the physical, the social, and the political. Third, a different way of understanding the way in how God governed the world emerged. Instead of working through the body of Christ, i.e. the church, which was the pre-Constantinian understanding, God now worked through the emperor. The role of the devoutly religious was to focus on the inner spiritual health of the citizens and their leaders, and provide advice and advocacy so that their leaders could make wise social decisions. The church, in accepting the invitation to operate within the power structure of the empire, became irrelevant in how the world moves forward. It no longer had a direct role in the process or offered an alternative process or an alternative political practice that challenged the ways of the empire. Its quote-unquote political function was replaced with a purely religious purpose. Charles Villavicencio, a noted South African theologian, notes, the invitation by the Emperor Constantine in 312 CE to the Church, hitherto persecuted and prevented from having any direct political influence, to operate from within the power structures of the state, resulted in the Church's capitulation to imperial demands. Constantine achieved by kindness, it has been suggested, what his predecessors had not been able to achieve by force. The fourth trait that Harry mentions is a distinction between the religious and the laity. Insofar as one could speak about the visible church, it became associated with the church hierarchy. For example, those who were religious or part of religious orders and those who were priests. This dualism also introduced a distinct ethic between those who were religious from those who were lay people. It was not expected that everyone, the laity, could live a righteous life. Likewise, the empire even provided special exemptions to the religious, as it was beneficial to the empire. Eusebius, an early Christian historian, for example, comments that clergy were exempt from all public duties, that they may not by any error or sacrilegious negligence be drawn away from the service duty to the deity, but may devote themselves without any hindrance to their law. For it seems that when they show greatest reverence to the deity, the greatest benefits accrue to the state. The definitions of the faith could thus no longer take the assembly of believers as its base. As a result, therefore, the eyes of those looking for the church had to turn to the clergy, especially to the episcopacy, and henceforth the church meant the hierarchy and the institution more than the people. Harry makes the observation that there is an inherent contradiction in this duality between the religious and the laity. The Constantinian synthesis affirms that everyone is Christian by law, and yet at the same time, not everyone is Christian by conviction. And the fifth trait. When Christianity encompassed everyone within the empire, an alternate guiding source other than the Bible and the insights of the worshiping community became the basis in how people were to relate. The ways of Jesus, in other words, were no longer understood as realistic for the way society in total relates to one another. Thus, greater emphasis is placed on law and policy making as the empire became the entity responsible for social and political matters. So this newly found relationship between the church and the empire began to shape the assumptions and the roles of each. This had many implications. This shift changed the ecclesiological, or the character and witness of the church, its understanding of what it meant to be the church itself, and its political or its social involvement. Indeed, even its basic understanding of politics in and of itself, along with its missional focus. Whereas before Constantine, the church was concerned for the way it followed and embodied the ways of Jesus, the church after Constantine became primarily concerned with what it believing rightly or believing correctly or orthodoxy. Thus, a disconnect emerged between the beliefs of the church from the lived expression that sought to imitate Jesus' lived example. Indeed, due to the above traits of this shift, the church was no longer a particular or peculiar community, as everyone in the empire was now, at least officially, part of the church. In my opinion, one of the most significant changes that occurred in this shift was the way in which power was understood. Let me just get and this shift in how power was understood has affected the church since that time. I want to look quickly at Acts chapter 1. In Acts chapter 1, we find an interesting little story that talks about power and the nature of power. In Acts chapter 1, verses 4 to 8, we see Jesus, after his resurrection, once again with his apostles or with his disciples. And he's reminding them of the promise that he has made of another helper, of someone who will come and help them in their life to continue to follow in the ways of truth. And here he talks and he begins to remind them that they will be receiving power when the Holy Spirit, this other helper, descends upon them. And there's excitement. Is this the time that the kingdom is going to come? Is this the time that the kingdom of Israel will be restored? And Jesus said to them, "It is not for you to know times or seasons which the Father has put in his own authority, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." This particular passage, it seems to me, talks and gives a particular understanding of power and the way in which power is understood for the disciples of Jesus. In this particular verse, for example, Jesus promises that we will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon us. But the power that we will receive is to be witnesses, is to be a witness to Jesus. And the word that's the interesting part of this is that the word for witnesses is actually the Greek word martus, which is also the word that was used to describe martyrs. And so here we learn about a particular character of the type of power that Jesus is promising. You will receive power not to rule, not to govern, not to force, but to be witnesses, to actually die because of me, for others. And in fact, we see the example that Jesus is talking about through Jesus' life. Jesus here is referencing to what just happened to him. This is the type of power that you will be receiving. The power to have the capability to die for the other. But this isn't the type of power that has become understood or assumed within the church. And part of the reason, I think, part of the reason is the way in which power was interpreted through the empire, and we've accepted that interpretation. Here, for example, is a picture of Constantine's conversion. Just as he was about to go into battle against Maxentius, he saw a cross in the sky with a symbol underneath that said, "Conquer by this," or in the name of, conquer by this. And so the cross becomes a symbol by which others are to be conquered. And Constantine failed to understand the cross as a symbol of agape, or self-sacrificial love. Thus, instead of interpreting this image as conquer through agape love, the cross was co-opted into justifying the violent, coercive power of the empire as it conquered its enemies. Harry, for example, once again, he notes that Constantine's reading of the sign was a military reading from the start. He understood there to be only one form of power, namely military power. So if the cross was to help him, it could do so only as a weapon of war. And so the way in which we have understood power, the way in which we have come to assume what power means, and the way in which we seek it or embody it, is one that carries the characteristics of it being coercive, top-down, and violent. Here's an image, for example, of a painting by Raphael of Christianity's victory, or Christianity defeating paganism. So we can see already the nature of the power that is being assumed. Christianity is that which defeats, overcomes, and forces onto others. And here we have the cross defeating paganism, and you can see the paganism on the floor, broken, while the cross stands victorious. Here's another image later on, just an image that I found on Google Images of the Crusades. And here we see an image of Richard the Lionheart, the King of England, who stands. You can see just the way in which the image is created. Here Richard is standing in the middle of the image with his axe and his sword by his side, the cross on his chest. And the church leaders are on the sides, praying, blessing, and sending the emperor, the king, the political leaders to be their ambassadors, in essence. In fact, interestingly, Constantine understood himself and actually defined himself as the 13th disciple, or as a 13th disciple, as a bishop ordained by God to take care of things outside of the church. But of course, by the time of this Constantinian shift, those who were within the empire were part of the church. And so to be ordained by God for matters outside of the church was to be ordained, was to be the one who took care of the way in which other people or the way in which you met other empires, other people outside of your particular empire. So those are just some images that go to demonstrate a bit of this shift in power that I think takes hold of the church as well. Alan Boesak, another South African, another significant South African theologian, provides a good summary regarding the shift towards Christendom. He says, before the Constantinian period, the Christian church was a band of people, ethnically and socially mixed, politically neither influential nor powerful. When under Constantine, Christianity became a state religion, however, the church changed. From then on, church and state would be allies. The confession of the church became the confession of the state, and the politics of the state became the politics of the church. The politics of the kingdom of God would henceforth be subjected to the approval of Caesar. The end result is that the church, in grappling with the question of power, begins to mimic the structure and approach, and sometimes even the very goals of empire itself. Charles Villavicencio once again states, one of the consequences of the alliance between the historic Constantinian alliance between the church and state has been the emergence of a hierarchy of control in the church, similar to that which exists within the state. Indeed, in many situations, the church is today more authoritarian, more hierarchical, more oppressive, and less democratic, less participatory, and less liberating than the state. To put this in my own words, the church's imagination, through its intimate relationship with empire, is reshaped and begins to embrace the way and the ways of empire, such as the definition and understanding of power. Power, or the ability to affect something, including the way in which one relates to others, came to be understood as a central characteristic of the empire as it was given the task to care for the social and the political within its territory. The church, therefore, released its understanding and definition of power and adopted the empire's understanding. The empire now simply relied on the church to justify and bless its use of power as its rightful handler through its practices and conquests. The history of Christendom has been long-standing, and the intimate relationship between the church and the state has provided the church with unprecedented privilege and participation in this form of power within society. Thus, to think about losing that power and privilege is met with mixed emotions. Drew Hart, for example, a brilliant young scholar in the U.S., wrote a little reflection on post-Christendom and the attitudes that meet such an idea. And he notes, I'm going to just summarize quickly, but he notes that there are three basic ways in which people respond to the idea of post-Christendom. And one is a response of lament. He notes, for this community, Christendom is the way things ought to be. The church is supposed to control and encompass all of society. That Christianity should be expressed seamlessly from the top down through every institution, political body, and social entity is common sense. Christendom is good. If that is the case, then the possibility that we are entering a post-Christendom era is a terrible thing. It is a failure of the church and a sign that our society is currently on a steady decline. These advocates of Christendom lament that we are losing power and influence in society. The second one that he talks about is the opportunistic shift. And here he says, this group doesn't want to judge or take sides against Christendom because they see, yes, they recognize that there were some faults, and yes, they recognize how the church was co-opted by the Christendom paradigm. But they don't want to judge or take sides against Christendom either, because they are our ancestors and they make mistakes, just as we are likely to make mistakes as well. Rather than condemning the past, the focus is purely on examining and engaging the new future context in which a plethora of possibilities reside. These post-Christendom Christians are excited and pumped about jumping ship from the now failing methods of Christendom to the new post-Christendom praxis they are discovering. And then he mentions a third alternative, or a third reaction. And he describes as those who see the shift as that between life and death. And in some ways, these folks are similar to the second critique in that they also see the problematic parts of Christendom, but they respond differently. And here I think it's worth just to quote him a bit extensively. He says, from this vantage point, choosing to ignore the past failures in favor of future possibility is not an option. The only moving forward they will do flows from their strength to look back and be truthful about where they have come from. For them, there is nothing further in its characteristics than Christendom and true Christianity. Christendom is much more than a few missteps and co-options. It is a betrayal of the name of Jesus Christ and the way of life he embodied. Christendom took on the form of conquest and was the engine for colonizing of the global south and its descendants around the world. It also took on the form of white supremacy in the U.S. for 400 years, because whiteness and Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity at one time were basically interchangeable terms. Slavery, lynching, KKK, white flight, the creation of black ghettos, mass incarceration, and on we go, are all the legacy of the further distortions of Christendom in the United States. Christendom was a nightmare, especially for many Christian communities who were courageous enough to hold on to their faith in a non-domineering Jesus who identified and joined with the sufferers of the world, despite the death-dealing violence and oppression they lived under. Post-Christendom is not a decline in Christianity. If anything, it is the very possibility of its truthful and organic growth. This posture isn't primarily about new, cool, and more effective practices for the future. Rather, this has always been about current realities of life and death, and the death of Christendom inherently means the present possibility for life-giving communities to gather around the resurrected one, who is no longer deceptively being called upon to justify empire. This gives I hope this gives a bit of a look into the notion and concept of Christendom. A lot of this is probably standard and probably things that you have already known. But I think it's good for us to simply begin to and understand that from where we're coming from, so that we can also pay attention to where we want to go. This might be a good time, Stan, to stop for any questions or any comments that people might have, or for me to read some of them that have already been typed. So I'll invite you back on the stage here.
Well, Andrew, thank you for the way you covered this in such a, I think, in terms of more of a unique way, is covering the duality, of what Christendom, both pre and post, and the results of Christendom. That duality was very helpful. But also, your comments on power led Ralph to comment very relevant to the vote in the UK Parliament this evening to use force to defeat ISIS. And then Anton also, this unpacking of power as being understood as coercive and violent seems to continue to curse our world. While I believe that Jesus called us to be a different understanding of power, it is so hard to share that countercultural understanding. Would you like to add some comments to both Ralph and what Anton have shared?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, and it's not easy to embrace this this alternative understanding of power, especially when it seems like on the surface it's going to be less effective. And so we feel that we can't stay on the sidelines. We have to do something, and we have, we only have a certain amount of tools that we know of that we can use, and we have to try to find ways of stopping something. That's, I think, what is currently happening now. And that's the question that we're all wrestling with. But this also comes back to the whole question of faithfulness versus effectiveness and so on and so forth. And what seems to be efficient and effective on the surface, unfortunately, oftentimes tends not to be in the long run. And the irony is that which tends to be faithful in the long run tends to actually be more helpful. Mm-hmm. It's just very difficult to see that far into the future and have hope and faith that far into the future. Yeah. So it's not an easy it's not an easy understanding, and it's not an easy understanding for those who don't operate from the belief and from the conviction of the lordship of Jesus. It's not an easy conviction to embrace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like there's this dance that's going on. Is it values shaping behaviors and practices? As we move in this Christendom, post-Christendom world, and as you were talking about the shift that took place, from the early church to Christendom, was it values shaping behaviors, or was it also behaviors and practices reshaping values of the church?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is a very important that's a very important thing to highlight. And this is where there's a brilliant little book that Alan Kreider wrote called The Change of Conversion and the Origin of Christendom, which is a brilliant little book that talks about and looks at the change in how conversion was understood, and how faith itself and the coming to faith was understood. And he unpacks that beautifully, where he looks at how the church, the early church, spent years shaping the way in which people would live and react, and what values they would embody. And through that practice, not even at the beginning, but even more towards the end, then they would begin to teach the theological reasons why they live this way. So the faith itself and the embodiment of a particular way of life is already entrenched in the new converts, the people who were wanting to join the church. And it was something. There were habits that they learned how to embody and how to put into practice in their daily life. There are times when I'm a bit skeptical in how we understand conversion because of that. We regularly talk about a change in belief, but rarely do we see such a focus on a change in practice and the way in which we live.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not sure that we can separate those two.
Yeah, it's kind of that idea of values and beliefs are harder to change, but changing behaviors and practices have the greatest capacity to change values and beliefs. Just a couple of comments here. Gita also commented on the church being less liberating than the state. She found to be very compelling. Enton also shares violent responses are a failure of tools and a failure of imagination. And like Enton, I think that was a wonderful start. And then Tara, I've been thinking about how a Christ-centered imagination makes possible inspiration, incarnational, and improvisational discipleship. Would you like to comment on that? And then we'll go back, we'll give you return to your presentation.
I'm trying to understand Tara's comment. Those are big words that I'm not sure I...
Maybe Tara can unpack that a little more for us, and we can bring that up again.
Yeah, there you go. Unpack that a bit, and then we can talk about it at the end.
She's typing away. So, Andrew, I'm going to step off so you can continue, and we'll get back to Tara's. She says it might take longer than what we have. We may have to bring her on. So, all right, I'll step away.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. Well, okay. Within the South African story, in South Africa, sorry, let me just get to, the church in South Africa arrived through and with a Christendom model. It was the Christendom-based understanding of church that arrived in South Africa in the 17th century. And that has since shaped the character and the imagination of the church, as well as the state within South Africa. I'm not going to be able, we don't have time to go through all of the things that I wanted to cover about the South African story, which is a bit of a shame. But I did want to highlight, in 1985, there was a particular document that was written that I think helpfully explains and characterizes the different understandings of church and the different understandings of what type of theology has come to exist in the South African context. In 1985, there was the Kairos document was written by a group of people, largely from the townships in South Africa. Now, to understand that, you have to understand kind of apartheid infrastructure and whatnot. In South Africa, during apartheid, cities and towns, they all had different segregated spaces. The town itself, it was the place where whites could live. That's where whites belonged. And then each town or city, no matter how small or big, there were usually three different townships meant for different race groups. One of them being Indians, people whose lineage came from indentured servants that were brought over from India. Another township would be for coloreds, so-called coloreds, or those of mixed race, and another township would be for those who were black. And so the people who wrote the Kairos document, and this is important, the people who wrote the document, who came together to work on it, or from which it emerged, I should say, were largely from the township areas. In other words, they were from the outside of power during apartheid. They weren't from within the kind of the white spaces. And they depicted three forms of theology: state theology, church theology, and prophetic theology. I'm just going to quickly run through these forms of theology, and just to kind of give you an idea as to what it is that they were talking about. State theology was understood as that which justified, was a theology that justified the policies of the state and the status quo. And to understand the reason why the challenging of the status quo was a good thing, was deemed to be a good thing from their perspective, you have to understand what the status quo was enforcing in South Africa during apartheid. The status quo made sure that a small minority group of whites were in positions of power and privilege, and laws that were brought about came to enforce that reality. And so here are some images from that era, from that time, that just kind of help to demonstrate the lack of dignity and the lack of respect for those who were outside of the small white minority. This is a picture of Hector Peterson from the 1976 Soweto uprising. The status quo brought a lot of violence and oppression to those who were not white. This is an image from the Sharpeville massacre. And the aftermath of that. And so the status quo in South Africa was something that did not bring about a lot of respect, did not portray dignity, did not treat people with dignity, and did not see people as humans. And state theology was that form of theology that justified the policies of the state. And so it's noteworthy to say that state theology does not, and it did not begin from the margins, but it began from the position of state power. In many ways, state theology was and is Christendom theology. And the church, when it first arrived in South Africa, came hand in hand with those in power, and it came with this theological imagination. Let me just highlight a couple of historic comments just to kind of demonstrate this mentality. Bishop Webb in 1897 said, "Missionary work viewed under the light of the eternal purpose of God is the inner meaning of history, the far-off divine event to which the whole of creation moves. It is the call as citizens of our British Empire and as sons and daughters of our British Church to rise up in furtherance of this end to their truly imperial responsibility and their imperial mission and destiny." So the purpose of mission was very closely related to purposes of the British Empire, according to Bishop Webb. H.J. Kidd in 1947 commented, "Unfortunately, wherever the church went, the state, like Mary's little lamb, was also bound to go. For the Church of England, as by law established, was subject to the royal supremacy. Where its bounds spread, its bonds spread also. And a bishop beyond the seas was no less an official and a servant of the crown in matters ecclesiastical than was a governor in matters civil and political." And the famous missionary John Philip makes the comment, or makes one comment. Missionary stations are the most efficient agents which can be employed to promote the internal strength of our colonies, and the cheapest and best military posts a government can employ. This was the understanding of the church that arrived in South Africa. There was an assumption, and there's an assumption within state theology, that the church and the state were heading in the same direction, and they were walking in partnership with one another. Now, the Kairos document also talked about church theology. Church theology was defined or described as the form of theology that was not concerned with social realities. In other words, church theology was the critique against those churches that didn't want to participate in the struggle against apartheid, because they saw apartheid as a political struggle and a political reality, and the church wasn't to get involved in politics. And so it stood on the sidelines, and even though some of these churches created documents and statements that did not support apartheid and criticized it, in practice there was very little that was done. Indeed, in some of these churches, because they weren't supposed to get involved into political conflicts, which apartheid was seen as, they would try to step and avoid these things. But there were also situations, there were also times when they assumed that they had to fulfill their duty to the state as citizens of the state. And so even though they didn't want to get involved in politics per se, they sent their kids to the military, to serve in the military. They provided chaplains for the military, which was the backbone of the South African apartheid order. And so the critique against church theology was that it attempted to be neutral when neutrality wasn't really possible. And the reason why they were trying to be neutral was because the gospel does not pertain, they thought, to socio-political realities. And so in response, the Kairos document tried to create and tried to encourage and invite churches to be prophetic. And they understood prophetic theology as a challenge and a call to the church to actively confront injustice and oppression and strive for justice and true peace, recognizing that what was happening, the oppression that was happening under apartheid, and even in particular conflicts that we may I lost the word that the circumstances that existed at that time weren't going to bring about true peace. And so here we have particular and significant figures like Beyers Naudé, who was the founder and the director of the Christian Institute, Steve Biko, Desmond Tutu, etc. I can go further into talking about the prophetic movement, but I think I'm going to have to move past that just to get to the Anabaptist part. Anabaptism in South Africa has I think, provided an interesting and different expression and theology, and it's been interesting to look at the history. The history of how it has been of influence or been a resource for people in South Africa during apartheid, and now post apartheid South Africa. With regards to the Anabaptist Network in South Africa, our focus has been to walk with, support, and create communities of peace, justice, and reconciliation in the South African context. In striving to do this, one particular thing that has become important for us and our journey has been to create spaces that embody a different way in which people relate to one another. Not surprisingly, space became a highly contested symbolic and political issue in South Africa. Apartheid's laws and the segregated spaces it created came to represent a violent imposition that dehumanized and oppressed those who did not have a share in the privilege of the apartheid system. Thus, in order to challenge the system, alternative spaces were created where people sought to embody a different political reality that was not based on racial superiority or inferiority, but rather in recognizing one another's humanity. Such spaces provided a new sense of dignity, humanity, and belonging among those who defied the law that the apartheid government created and which it sought to enforce. And this is what I would describe as the prophetic movement, the movement in which people have, and organizations and churches have found to create spaces of alternative practice in the midst of the apartheid era. Although the apartheid system was defeated, many of the implications, realities, and imaginations that apartheid created remain today. Thus, much of our work has been to continue to create spaces whereby another reality and imagination can be created, one that is based on self-sacrificial love for the other, on dignity, and radical hospitality. We strive to create spaces whereby everyone belongs and where everyone matters. What apartheid separated, we have sought to bring together. Stepping out of racially segregated enclaves in South Africa has been slow. Apartheid infrastructure still exists. Racism and its rooted biases continue to dominate, for example, in universities and the educational system. The gap between the rich and poor continues to grow. The new state is increasingly using old repressive tools and approaches, including violence and censored access to information, to maintain its rule. And violence continues to be the go-to method in dealing with one another. And yet people want something different. University students, I don't know if you've been watching and paying attention in the last couple of months, but university students in South Africa have had enough and want transformation. People are increasingly calling into question the brutality and the violent practices of the police. There is increased pressure against the all too apparent corruption that has taken root. And so Anabaptism in this context has been a faith orientation that fosters community, challenges injustice and violence in peace, and responds to the social realities of our commitment to the lordship of Jesus and the ways of his kingdom. In doing so, ANISA, the Anabaptist Network in South Africa, often tends to be a place or a space where people can explore and participate in a different reality. We try to help create a different kind of space that embodies a different kind of politics. We invite each other into our homes. We eat together. This was illegal 20 years ago. We care for each other. We listen to each other. We assume that the Holy Spirit can speak through each one of us. We try to embody the peace, the justice, and the reconciliation that we want to see in society. Such spaces provide a sense of belonging. Ultimately, we try to embody a foretaste of the future that is desired in the way in which we relate to one another. It is precisely when we form communities that seek to embody and witness to Jesus' politics, rather than being co-opted by the politics of the state, do we become a prophetic witness in the world. In following Jesus, we are invited to participate in an already established, albeit not fully fulfilled, kingdom that seeks to embody a different understanding of power. Rather than relying on the old top-down hierarchical forms of power, God's kingdom turns it upside down, or perhaps I should say right side up, as it invites people to be a people who live for the well-being of the other. And this offers, I believe, an alternative vision in what it means to be Christian, and what it means to follow in the ways of Jesus in our world. And it often is a faith orientation that moves beyond the Christendom imagination. I'll stop there. I'll invite Stan back on.
Andrew, I wonder if what you just talked about in terms of the experience in South Africa is not also, in some ways, touching on the comment by Tara as to what might a Christ-centered imagination look like. What might it inspire? What might it embody when you were talking about community in a sense, you're doing discipleship in a very improvisational way. It's fluid, it's flexible, it's not structured like it would be in a more Christendom model. Want to also share, Wayne made a comment. He says, it feels like South Africa and the U.S. are currently on a similar journey with issues of race. So the question is, how does Anabaptism walk the road of reconciliation and peace with rising consciousness and deeply fractured spaces?
Mm-hmm. This is a good friend of ours in Cape Town, and I didn't tell him not to heckle me, so yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I think he's absolutely right. There's a lot of similarities, and interestingly, historically, there's also been a lot of cross-pollinization between South Africa and the U.S. as well. And I think that continues, and I think that's a good thing. Part of it is thinking about who is it that we want to be as a people of God, as participants in God's kingdom. Who is it that we want to be, and how do we begin to enact that already? And part of this pertains to, I think, the way in which we respond to injustice. It's not about not responding to injustice, but also in the way in which we respond to it. Who we stand with, literally, physically. I think that makes that's a very important thing to do, is be there. Some people call it a ministry of presence. Some people call it, and all that is right. It's being with the people. It's being with those who are suffering. And in fact, it's taking the time and being with them and learning, in fact, from them and letting them be our teachers, that we can learn a lot more as to why and how shalom, peace, is not yet present in our world. And if we take them seriously, we can begin to understand a bit more as to what needs to change in our world for shalom to in fact reign. There's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot that can be said, yeah. But I think that those are just some things that pop into my mind, and I think that those have been important lessons that we have learned in the South African context as well. And I suspect that that's also an important thing that people are learning and grappling with in the U.S. context as well. I think of, for example, the whole Black Lives Matter, etc. It's precisely that we need to learn from, yeah, and we need to be with.
Yeah. Andrew, hold on one second. I'm going to ask Anton to step on. He has just a couple of things that we need to take care of here towards the end of the webinar. So, Anton, if you will join us.
Thanks, Stan. I'll leave you all on stage and just note we have 2 quick questions for evaluation for those of you that have participated with us today. The first is, how helpful was the presentation? What Andrew was able to share with us. And the second is, how well did you like this webinar format, this online meeting? I've posted in the chat window live links for being able to obtain CEUs, but I'll also put that up there on your screens. But then Stan and Andrew, I'll turn it right back to you all to continue the conversation.
Hey, there you are. All right.
Yeah.
Well, with what you were just saying, it kind of takes us back to some of those points that you were making earlier. Before the church, really before the Christian community became one of a Christian, really kind of under that Christendom model, where you're talking about humility and modesty and meekness. It's like instead of imposing our way to the into the room, or are imposing and taking a seat at this table, we're being, it's one of being vulnerable and being asked, is what it would seem like. So again, it comes down to, in my mind, values and imagination, and those values then shape our imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree.
What are some other ways that you're seeing this happen? And also, Ralph brings up, how do you feel about some of the partners you may link up with by standing against injustice?
Well, which partners?
Yeah, partners.
I mean, it seems. I think it seems to me that the one of the calling of the church, and being the ecclesia and being the called out ones, is to demonstrate a different way, or maybe the original way. I have a good friend of mine bugs me all the time that I shouldn't talk about the alternative way. I should talk about the original way, and I think he's right. That maybe that we're invited to try to demonstrate the way in which God wanted us to relate to one another. And when there's injustice, or when people are being treated badly, or when people don't have enough, or when people are suffering, the way in which we relate isn't going to be, it's not going to be possible to relate with one another rightly. There's going to be hurdles in the way. And so we have to try to find ways of being able to create and being able to work towards that opportunity in which we can exist together. We can be a community that demonstrates the love of God for all, to all. And so part of that is being aware and being vigilant about where is injustice, and how do we stand against injustice. But just as important to that, and this is the thing that I think we also have to pay attention to, which sometimes I think gets overlooked, is not just about standing up against injustice, but it's also how do we stand against injustice. I think James, for example, there's a wonderful verse in James where it talks about that the seed of righteousness, the fruit of righteousness is grown in peace by those who make peace.
Yeah.
The way we plant and the seeds that we use are going to be vital and important elements in what kind of fruit we in fact want to pick and what kind of fruit we want to grow. So if we want to grow the fruit of righteousness, which, of course, biblically is very closely related and linked to justice. If we want the fruit of righteousness, then we also have to pay attention to how we plant those seeds. And I think that sometimes also gets, and I think this speaks to a lot of the conflicts that are happening around the world. We want to end war. Yes, that is good. And yet we are using tools and weapons of war to do so.
Right.
Well, hold on. What kind of fruit is that seed going to now sprout? And likewise, and that's at a big international scale. But those same realities exist even in community kind of protest, type times as well. And so it's being aware of not just the injustice that exists and standing up against the injustice and being a presence against injustice, but in doing so in a certain way that also demonstrates the justice that you want, the peace that you want, the relationship that you want. I think that that's a vital thing. I don't know if that gets to what Ralph is commenting on, but those are just some comments or some things that came to my mind.
I think it's what Tara is stating in her comment just above Ralph and Anton, where she says, right, when you allow Christ to inspire action and embodiment Christ's life in ways that make space for improvisation on the theme of sacrificial love and community. And I think that's really what you've been talking about in this presentation. So, well, Ralph says thank you, and I want to say thank you as well. Andrew, this has been wonderful, very thought-provoking. I also enjoyed the way that you've taken things that we've heard and you've reshaped them and put it in some different context for us as well. And just a terrific job of sharing with us. And to everyone that has joined us, I want to thank you for Wayne and Andrew. Gosh, you guys are getting close to 11 o'clock at night. So it's been a long day for you. So we just want to appreciate your time, your wisdom, your insight, and thank you for sharing with us. And to everyone that joined us on this webcast, thank you so much. We appreciate your comments and questions and your support. And please come back. Judith Kilpin will be presenting in January, on the 13th of January, I believe. It's a Thursday. Same time, 2:30 Eastern Time, 7:30 UK. And we want to invite you to join us again. And she'll be sharing on her understanding of one of the core convictions of Anabaptism. So to everyone, Andrew, to your family, and you, Merry Christmas, God's blessing and God's peace. And to all of you joining us on this webcast, thank you so much. Anton, for your support, for all you attending, Merry Christmas, and many blessings during this Advent season. Take care. God bless. We hope to see you again in 2016. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.